What's up, guys? Today's video is a little bit different, but then again, it's sort of like the same. I'm going to talk about the first rap opera, or first hip-hopera. Uh, but there's a lot of contention about what the first hip-hop opera is, because a lot claim it. So forget all that kind of stuff you see like on Broadway or off-Broadway or off-Broadway, or there's that Beyonce movie, which is actually a remake of a legit opera from like the 1800s. I think it was a French opera. Of course, they obviously stuck it in New York and they added rapping and stuff into it. But it's not that. It's not stuff like the Prince Paul. He's done a couple albums which are essentially rap operas, or Deltron 3030. Some of you guys might remember that the Fugees' second album, The Big Score, which is, the big Fugees album, is kind of labeled as a hip-hop opera, but there's really not too much narrative or anything to that. They just kind of say it is one. But actually, the first one ever, all the way back to the 80s, I can go back to the 80s for this. And by the way, I'm talking about a legit opera that's done in hip-hop style. For example, you had things like Malcolm McLaren, where they had like opera music, like classical opera songs kind of mixed into hip-hop. But I'm talking about an actual hip-hop opera. And so I would say the first one here is by none other than the Fat Boys, On and On, 1989. This is their sixth album. They had 3 on Sutra and 3 on Polydor, and this is the last of those. So they had the 3 on Sutra, which are their early kind of classic albums. Then they had the 3 on Polydor, which was sort of like their big mainstream kind of crossover stuff. And that was basically, this was kind of the end of the Fat Boys. Then they broke up. Prince Marky D, of course, went solo. The Fat Boys kind of came together again for one last album, but without Prince Marky D, so it was just Buff Love and Cool Rock, and they were on an independent label, Ichiban, and that was sort of the end of the Fat Boys. So this was the end of their big days, their big money days, major label days, On and On. Again, 1989. So what makes a rap opera? It's not, necessarily, again, about opera music, like I was saying with Malcolm McLaren, and it's not just that they label it a hip-hop opera on the album cover, although even that is unique. This is done, basically, this is sort of an answer to The Who's Tommy, which is the first rock opera, which of course later on became like a big movie and big Broadway productions and stage productions around the world, but originally it was just an album. But it's an opera because it's a narrative album where all the songs are leading you through a story, and that's what this is here. So if you don't even so if you want to, you can kind of choose to completely ignore the opera side of it, and it's just like, 13 Fat Boy songs of, their kind of caliber. Sort of not their best album. It's kind of an interesting mix. The Fat Boys, to their credit, were taking over a lot more of the production and writing and making more of an original album with this. But on the other hand, it doesn't have either the kind of the credibility of their older stuff or the big, massive mainstream production of their, first 2 Polydor albums, where they were either doing stuff with like the Beach Boys or Marley Marl or just all kinds of big names all across the map. This is a little bit more localized, a little bit more, again, the Fat Boys doing most of their own sound here, but still with the big budget behind it, and definitely lots of different songs here have a variety of styles. You got like kind of a reggae style, you got a love song, of course, you got one where they're kind of doing sort of like their voices are kind of filtered like through a phone. The Beastie Boys blew up with that So What You Want and Pass the Mic and stuff, where they really kind of sound like they're rapping through telephone. And again, they do that here first. The Fat Boys beat them to it. Although it's really just on the hook, I think. On the verses, they sound a little bit more natural, but it's the hook that has that whole kind of style to it. This is how the album opens up. After the introduction, this is the first song. So Buff Love's Girlfriend is Telling Lies. Although, again, when you listen to the song, they're not really rapping the story of the opera. So, like a lot of this is just about people fronting, and Prince Marky D has a whole thing about this guy who buys a car to impress girls in their neighborhood, but it turns out he didn't buy it, it's just rented, and somebody sees that the license plate is from Hertz or something. That's kind of how the verse ends, and it's sort of a jokey, lighthearted, sort of like You Be Illin', not quite that extreme of a joke, but very lighthearted kind of songs about lies. But thematically, if you are following the story, then the whole issue of lies and stuff comes up in the opera, and so when you read the story and you get this song, it sort of fits, sort of doesn't. And this is a 12-inch single here. This was their first single. There was a video for it and everything. There's a couple mixes on here, but nothing really special. Like, there's a 12-inch mix, a shorter 7-inch mix. There's an instrumental, but there's no remixes or exclusive B-sides. There is an album B-side, On and On, which is the title track of the album, so that's on here too. Certainly a fun picture cover. Note the look on their grills and everything. And then they did have one more single, Just Loungin'. I don't think there was a video for this one. And this comes up much later in the story, and it's even like the title sort of implies, I guess, it's sort of a break from the story, kind of a slow point, and it's just kind of a laid-back track about lounging. This 12-inch does have a couple exclusive remixes on here, no other B-sides, just the one song. But interestingly, again, Fat Boys did most of their own stuff at this point, or at least working kind of with studio guys, and obviously, even from the beginning, they were doing a lot of their own scratches. Buff Love, besides being a human beatbox, is also a DJ. Sometimes he calls himself the Ox that Rocks and stuff like that. All the same guy. But here on this song, they have scratches by none other than Fresh Gordon. So that's kind of cool. So it's all over the map, and it's basically just a kind of random Fat Boys album if you choose to take it like that. But if you pay attention, it's a full narrative, a story about the Fat Boys. They go on an adventure. The album both begins and ends with some skits, some kind of introduction stuff by Dr. Dre and Ed Lover. This was back, again, 1991, so they were on MTV, MTV Raps at the time. And they come on and they start to tell you the story. And then as you listen to the songs, you can follow the story. And what sets this apart, even from something, again, like the Fugees, which kind of says it's a rap opera album, but, maybe not so much. What sets this apart is they actually do a whole libretto. Bam. In here. And it is seriously intense. Like, break out your magnifying glass. This is really small text and a lot of it. Also, a lot of photos, which only loosely associate with the story going on. Some of this is just them goofing around in photos. But there's some stuff, like in the story, they run into a Rastafarian, and then they do a reggae song. And so then you've got a photo of Buff Love in dreads. So it kind of hangs together. Now, not all of this is, so the idea is you read along with this to the album, and that's how you get the full story. But not all of this, this is a lot of text. And even back in the day, I'll be honest, I was a pretty big fan of the Fat Boys, and I kind of swallowed this stuff whole, but I did not ever once read along to this whole thing while listening to the album. I just didn't do it. But in more recent days now, for this video and stuff, I've kind of gone back for the fun of it and looked at it. And actually, really, for the first time, followed the story. But you don't really have to read the whole thing because a lot of it is just the lyrics to the song. And so if you're listening to the song, you're hearing most of it. But in between each song, there's dialogue and stuff credited to Dr. Dre and Ed Lover, although, obviously they didn't write the material and you don't hear their voices saying it. They're only on the album, they're only on the introduction and the closing. But in theory, they're your narrator through the whole opera. And they tell the story. It's kind of a crazy, weird story about Buff Love. He's in love with this girl, but it's his ex-girlfriend, and he wants to win her back. And so first he tries to make her jealous. That doesn't work. So then he goes on this kind of chasing her through Manhattan. And it gets pretty involved. Like, she hooks up with a drug dealer, and he follows them in his car, and then the other two Fat Boys are following him at the same time. Somebody actually gets shot in this. It's kind of an intense, weird little story. Being the Fat Boys, and again, this is them sort of trying to be a little bit more serious here. They're not really joking about, hey, we eat pizza like they did in a lot of their songs. They're trying to be credible artists, but they're still the Fat Boys, so there is still some humor and fun to it, so it is sort of an odd mix. And all of that is in here. So it is sort of a light story, it's sort of a silly story, but they're also trying to put some, I wouldn't say gravitas, because it never gets that serious, but there is, somebody gets shot. I'm not saying it's an amazing story. It's not. It's not a great opera either, and even by Fat Boys standards, it's not really a great album, although it's interesting. So if you're a Fat Boys fan, it's not a bad album, because they do still have the budget. It is all over the place, so if you don't like one song, don't worry, the next song is going to be completely different. One song actually on here is kind of their steamy, sexy song, which, coming from the Fat Boys might seem a little strange, but that's what it is. And it actually played heavily. It's from the movie She-Devil. Remember the movie where when Roseanne Barr was really at the peak of her career, her sitcom was huge, and she had her movie with Meryl Streep? There's a big scene in that movie where they're playing this song, so watch that movie and listen for this album. But if you're a big Fat Boys fan, you'll like this album. If you're not, though, this is definitely one to pass on. It's definitely not one of their stronger, better known albums. It doesn't have any major singles. It has the singles I just showed you, but they're not, essential classic singles or anything. They're not like Jailhouse Rap. They're not like Stick 'Em. They're not classic Fat Boy songs. There's nothing classic on here at all. But it does have, it is still the three of them, as opposed to their later album, and some, again, strong budget production styles and stuff. So it's kind of a cool, fun album, but definitely, pop, corny, mainstream, definitely if you're not feeling the Fat Boys, this will never convince you. But it is pretty interesting, and hey, it is also the first rap opera.